Atlantis Anunnaki, post-flood civilization, technology, submersion. When the Great Deluge swept across the land, this video presents a fictional narrative created for entertainment and storytelling purposes. The content was developed from the author's creative ideas with artificial intelligence support and does not represent real facts, news, or true reports. The gods looked down from their heavenly abode and witnessed the destruction they had wrought. Enki, the Wise One, shed tears for humanity. Enlil, the commander, declared the judgment final. Between them stood the remnants of a world that once gleamed with knowledge beyond our comprehension. What rose from those waters would be remembered only in whispers, in legends, in the half-forgotten dreams of civilizations yet to come. What if everything we think we know about human civilization is fundamentally wrong? What if the story of Atlantis is not a myth invented by Plato, but rather a fractured memory of an actual post-flood civilization built by beings we called gods? Could the Anunnaki, those mysterious deities from Sumerian texts, have established an advanced society in the aftermath of a catastrophic deluge, only to see it sink beneath the waves once more? These questions have haunted researchers, archaeologists, and truth-seekers for millennia. The tale of Atlantis appears not only in Greek philosophy, but echoes through Egyptian priest accounts, indigenous American legends, and curiously parallels the Sumerian narratives of antediluvian cities destroyed by divine flood. The Anunnaki, according to ancient Mesopotamian texts, were sky gods who descended to earth, created humanity, and governed through a complex hierarchy of divine authority. What follows are propositions that remain highly controversial within mainstream academia, theories that challenge our fundamental understanding of human origins and ancient history. Before we proceed, let us remember the words of Aristotle himself, who wisely stated, "It is the mark of an educated mind to entertain a thought without accepting it." What you are about to explore exists at the intersection of ancient mythology, archaeological anomalies, and speculative interpretation. Keep an open mind but maintain your critical faculties. Question everything, including what you are about to hear. The story begins not with Atlantis, but with water, with catastrophe, with the moment when the old world ended and survivors faced an Earth fundamentally transformed. Every major ancient civilization preserves flood narratives in their foundational texts. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, predating the biblical account by at least 1,000 years, describes in vivid detail how the god Enlil decided to destroy humanity through deluge. The text, discovered on clay tablets in the ruins of Nineveh, states, "For 6 days and 6 nights the winds blew, torrent and tempest and flood overwhelmed the world. When the 7th day dawned, the storm from the south subsided, the sea grew calm, the flood was stilled." This is not mythology in the sense of pure invention. This is remembered history, encoded in religious language, transmitted across generations. The Hebrew Bible echoes this same catastrophe in Genesis, describing how God regretted creating humanity and sent waters to cover even the highest mountains. The Hindu Puranas speak of Manu and a great fish, Matsya, who warns of impending flood and preserves the seeds of civilization. The Chinese have Gun Yu and the Great Flood. The Greeks preserved the story of Deucalion, son of Prometheus, who survived waters sent by Zeus to punish humanity's wickedness. Native American tribes from the Pacific Northwest to the Amazon basin maintain oral traditions of world-destroying floods and sky beings who came before or after to teach the survivors. Are we to believe that dozens of unconnected ancient cultures, separated by vast oceans and millennia, independently invented the exact same catastrophe narrative? Or is the more rational explanation that they are all describing the same historical event from different cultural perspectives? Modern geology, despite mainstream resistance, has begun acknowledging that something extraordinary occurred at the end of the last ice age, approximately 12,800 years ago. This period, known as the Younger Dryas boundary, marks one of the most dramatic climate shifts in recent geological history. Temperatures plummeted suddenly, massive glacial melting occurred, sea levels rose dramatically in some regions while dropping in others. The cause remains hotly debated. Some scientists propose an impact event, a comet or meteor striking the North American ice sheet, triggering rapid melting and global climate chaos. Others suggest volcanic eruptions or oceanic current shifts. What almost no mainstream scientist will openly consider is the possibility that this event was not entirely natural, that it may have been influenced or even engineered by an advanced intelligence for purposes we can only begin to imagine. The Sumerian king list, one of the most fascinating and controversial documents from antiquity, divides history into two distinct epochs, before the flood and after the flood. Before the deluge, according to this text, kings ruled for impossibly long periods, sometimes tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns become more reasonable, more human in scale. Traditional scholarship interprets these pre-flood numbers as symbolic or mythological. But what if they represent something else entirely? What if they indicate a different kind of ruler, beings who lived far longer than ordinary humans, beings who possessed knowledge and technology that seemed godlike to primitive peoples? The text explicitly states, after the flood had swept over the earth and when kingship was lowered again from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. These are not vague mythological assertions. These are specific claims about specific places, at specific times in a historical chronology, that the Sumerians themselves took literally. Zechariah Sitchin, the controversial Azerbaijani-born scholar who spent decades translating and interpreting Sumerian, Akkadian, and other ancient Near Eastern texts, proposed that the Anunnaki were not mythological at all, but rather extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago in search of gold. According to Sitchin's interpretation of the texts, these beings genetically engineered Homo sapiens as a worker species by combining their own DNA with that of Homo erectus. The flood in this interpretation was a natural catastrophe that the Anunnaki knew was coming but chose, or were ordered, not to warn humanity about. Enlil, the commander of the Anunnaki forces on Earth, wanted humanity eradicated, viewing us as a failed experiment that had become too numerous and too noisy. Enki, his half-brother and the chief scientist who had created humans in the first place, defied this order and secretly warned a human named Ziusudra, who built a vessel and preserved human and animal life through the catastrophe. Now, mainstream academics dismiss Sitchin's work entirely, calling his translations inaccurate and his interpretations wildly speculative. Professor Michael Heiser, a biblical scholar who specialized in ancient Semitic languages, spent considerable effort debunking Sitchin's linguistic methods, arguing that Sitchin mistranslated key terms and imposed modern concepts onto ancient texts. Fair enough. Healthy skepticism is essential. But here is what critics often ignore. Even if Sitchin's specific interpretations are flawed, the underlying texts he was working from are real. They describe real events and beings that the ancient Mesopotamians believed were historical fact, and those descriptions remain profoundly strange when read literally. The text described the Anunnaki as beings who descended from the sky, who possessed incredible technology, who could fly between heaven and earth, who performed what can only be described as genetic engineering, creating humans in their image through a process involving clay, which in context appears to mean biological material, and divine essence, which sounds remarkably like DNA. The Atrahasis epic, composed in the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE, but based on earlier Sumerian sources, provides perhaps the most detailed account of human creation and the flood. In this text, the lesser gods, the Igigi, are exhausted from digging waterways and mining operations. They rebel against their superiors. To solve this labor crisis, Enki proposes creating a primitive worker, mixing the clay with the flesh and blood of a slain god named Way-Ela. The goddess Nintu, also called Mami, assists in this creation process, which involves what sounds distinctly like biological experimentation. Let one god be slaughtered, and let the gods be cleansed by immersion. With his flesh and blood, let Nintu mix clay, that God and man may be thoroughly mixed in the clay. This is not symbolic language of metaphysical creation. This reads like a technical description of genetic hybridization. But there is a specific detail in these texts that changes everything. a detail we will return to later when we examine what happened immediately after the floodwaters receded. For now, simply know that the texts describe not one creation event, but multiple attempts, multiple genetic experiments, some of which produced beings who were not quite human, not quite Anunnaki, but something in between. These hybrid beings, according to certain interpretations, possessed capabilities beyond normal humans, but were not granted the same longevity as their creators. They were, in effect, a bridge species, and some researchers believe these hybrids became the builder class of an extraordinary post-flood civilization that we would later remember as Atlantis. Let us shift our focus to Plato, the Greek philosopher who first introduced the Western world to Atlantis in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE. Plato describes Atlantis as an island civilization located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which most scholars identify as the Strait of Gibraltar. According to his account, an Egyptian priest in the city of Sais told the Greek lawgiver Solon about this ancient civilization approximately 9,000 years before Solon's time, which would place Atlantis around 11,600 years ago, remarkably close to the Younger Dryas catastrophe. The priest describes Atlantis as a powerful naval empire that had conquered much of Western Europe and Africa before being defeated by ancient Athens and then destroyed in a single day and night of catastrophic earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the ocean waves. Now, for over 2,000 years, scholars have debated whether Plato invented Atlantis as a philosophical allegory or was reporting an actual historical account passed down through Egyptian sources. The conventional academic view leans heavily toward allegory. Plato, they argue, created Atlantis to illustrate his political philosophy about ideal states and the dangers of hubris and moral corruption. Everything about the story, they say, is too perfect, too symbolic, too conveniently aligned with Plato's philosophical agenda to be factual history. But consider this. Plato himself goes to extraordinary lengths to insist the story is true. In Timaeus, Socrates' student Critias declares, "The fact that it is not an invented fable but genuine history is all important." Why would Plato, known for clearly labeling his allegories and myths, make such an emphatic claim about historical authenticity if the entire account was his own invention? Would that not undermine his credibility as a philosopher and teacher? Moreover, Plato provides an unusual wealth of specific detail about Atlantis, far more than necessary for a simple philosophical allegory. He describes the island's geography, its concentric rings of land and water, its dimensions in Greek stadia, which scholars calculate to be approximately 130 kilometers in diameter. He describes its resources, including a mysterious metal called orichalcum that gleamed with red light and was second in value only to gold. He outlines its political structure, a confederation of 10 kingdoms ruled by the descendants of Poseidon, the god who supposedly founded the civilization with a mortal woman named Cleito. He details its military capabilities, its impressive navy, its armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. He describes its architecture, temples covered in silver and gold and orichalcum, magnificent palaces, and most intriguingly, hot and cold springs of water, suggesting geothermal activity. These are not the vague, dreamlike descriptions of pure myth. These are the kinds of specific details that emerge from actual historical accounts, even if distorted by time and retelling. The Egyptian priest who allegedly told Solon this story claimed that ancient Egypt had records going back 8,000 years before his time, records destroyed when the Library of Sais was lost to history. If such records existed, they would have been contemporary or near-contemporary accounts of Atlantis, not legends from the distant past. Egyptian chronologies are notoriously complex and contested, but we know that Egyptian civilization itself stretches back at least 5,000 years in unbroken recorded history, and quite possibly much further if we accept controversial interpretations of the Sphinx's water erosion, which geologist Robert Schoch argues indicates the monument is far older than conventional Egyptology admits, possibly dating to 10,000 BCE or earlier. Could Egyptian priests in Plato's time have truly possessed ancient documents describing a pre-flood civilization? Mainstream academics say no, but the evidence for cultural memory preservation is stronger than often acknowledged. Here is where the connections become intriguing, where Atlantis and the Anunnaki narratives begin to converge in unexpected ways. According to Plato, Atlantis was founded by Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea and earthquakes. But who was Poseidon in the context of earlier mythologies? The Greeks inherited and adapted much of their religious framework from earlier cultures, particularly Minoan Crete, and through them from Egypt and ultimately Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamian mythology, Enki was the god of water, of wisdom, of technology and craft. He resided in the Abzu, the subterranean ocean of sweet waters. He was humanity's patron and protector, the being who defied the other gods to preserve human life during the flood. The parallels between Enki and Poseidon are striking. Both are water deities, both are associated with creation and preservation of life, both are described as builders and technology givers, and both have complex relationships with humanity that sometimes involve genetic mixing with mortals. Sitchin and other alternative researchers have proposed that Atlantis was essentially an Anunnaki colony, established after the flood as part of the rebuilding of civilization. In this interpretation, when the floodwaters finally receded and the Anunnaki surveyed the damage to their installations and cities, they needed to rebuild quickly. But the flood had devastated their infrastructure, scattered their human worker population, and according to some texts, caused internal political chaos as different factions of Anunnaki blamed each other for the catastrophe. Enki, who had saved humanity against Enlil's wishes, supposedly received certain territories as his domain in the post-flood world. One of these territories, according to this theory, was a large island in the Atlantic Ocean, a remnant of land that had not been completely submerged during the deluge. Here, Enki, whom the later Greeks would call Poseidon, established an advanced colony, a hybrid civilization, where Anunnaki knowledge was combined with human labor, creating a society that appeared godlike to other surviving humans around the world. Think about what Plato describes: a civilization with concentric rings of water and land, which would require extraordinary engineering capability to construct. A civilization with hot and cold springs, suggesting advanced understanding of geothermal energy and sophisticated water management systems. A civilization with a mysterious glowing metal, orichalcum, which some researchers speculate might have been an alloy unknown to later ages, possibly with unusual electromagnetic properties. A civilization with the naval capability to project power across vast ocean distances, conquering territories in Europe and Africa. A civilization that supposedly existed 9,000 years before Solon, placing it at approximately 11,600 years ago, during or shortly after the Younger Dryas catastrophe. And then approximately 11,500 years ago, according to Plato's chronology, this mighty civilization was destroyed in a single day and night, sinking beneath the ocean in a catastrophe of earthquakes and floods. Does this sound like a primitive Bronze Age myth, or does it sound like a technological civilization that met a geological disaster? Let us examine what mainstream archaeology tells us about the period immediately following the last ice age, roughly 12,000 to 10,000 years ago. According to conventional theory, humans at this time were primitive hunter-gatherers, or at best, early agricultural experimenters. The Neolithic Revolution, the transition to farming and settled communities, was just beginning in a few isolated regions like the Fertile Crescent. Humans lacked metallurgy, lacked writing, lacked complex mathematics, lacked the organizational capacity for large-scale construction or long-distance maritime travel. Civilization, as we understand it, would not emerge for another 6,000 or 7,000 years with Sumer and Egypt. This is the orthodox timeline, and it is taught in every university, every textbook, every museum in the world. But is it accurate? Göbekli Tepe, discovered in southeastern Turkey and excavated beginning in the 1990s, has demolished significant portions of this orthodox timeline. This massive stone temple complex, featuring precisely carved megalithic pillars arranged in circles, some weighing up to 16 tons and standing over 5 meters tall, has been reliably dated to approximately 9600 BCE, making it over 11,000 years old. This means Göbekli Tepe was constructed at least 6,000 years before Stonehenge, and 7,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids. The archaeological community has been forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that complex monumental architecture, sophisticated symbolic art, and large-scale social organization existed far earlier than previously believed possible. The site shows no evidence of permanent habitation, suggesting it was a ceremonial center that drew people from considerable distances, implying a level of cultural sophistication and coordination that should not have existed among supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers. But Göbekli Tepe is not unique. It is part of a broader pattern of anomalous structures from this time period that mainstream archaeology struggles to explain. Gunung Padang in Indonesia, a massive terraced pyramid structure, has controversial dating that some researchers place at over 20,000 years old, though orthodox archaeologists dispute this, claiming the deeper layers are natural formations. Yet, ground-penetrating radar and core samples suggest regular chambers and carved surfaces buried beneath the visible structure. In Japan, the Yonaguni Monument, a series of apparently artificial stone terraces and geometric formations discovered underwater off the coast in 1987, displays architectural features including right angles, straight walls, and step formations that proponents argue could not be natural erosion. Conservative dating places the submersion of these structures at the end of the last ice age, approximately 10,000 years ago, again during the critical post-flood period. Most intriguing of all is the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, first proposed seriously in 2007 by a team of researchers led by Richard Firestone. This theory suggests that approximately 12,800 years ago, a fragmented comet or asteroid struck the North American ice sheet, triggering massive wildfires, rapid glacial melting, a brief return to Ice Age conditions, and mass extinction of large mammals, including mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths. The evidence includes a widespread layer of microscopic diamonds, magnetic spherules, and platinum anomalies found at the Younger Dryas boundary level across North America, Europe, and other regions. While controversial and still debated, this hypothesis provides a possible mechanism for the flood narratives preserved in every ancient culture. If a cosmic impact did trigger rapid sea level changes and global catastrophe, surviving populations would absolutely encode this traumatic event in their foundational mythologies. But here is what the impact hypothesis does not address, what mainstream science carefully avoids considering. If there was a technologically advanced civilization existing before this catastrophe, what would we expect to find? If the Anunnaki, or beings like them, had established cities and installations on Earth before 12,800 years ago, and if a cosmic impact and subsequent floods destroyed most of these settlements, what archaeological traces would remain? The answer is very little. The ocean levels rose over 100 meters as glaciers melted. Entire continental shelves that were once coastline and habitable land are now hundreds of feet underwater. Cities built on these ancient coasts would be submerged, scattered by millennia of ocean currents, covered by sediment undetectable except through sophisticated sonar and underwater archaeology, which has barely begun to explore the world's continental shelves. Moreover, given enough time, nearly 12,000 years, most organic materials would decay, most metals would corrode, most construction would crumble. What would survive? Only the most massive stone constructions, and even those would be so weathered and damaged that they might not be recognizable as artificial. Now, some researchers have proposed that Atlantis was not a single island in the Atlantic, but rather a maritime confederation with multiple centers, possibly including territories in the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic coast of both America and Africa. This would explain why similar cultural motifs, architectural styles, and technological knowledge appear in geographically separated ancient civilizations. If Atlantis was an Anunnaki colony network that traded and communicated across vast ocean distances, it could have spread knowledge and technology to various regions before its destruction. When Atlantis fell, the surviving outposts would have preserved fragments of this knowledge, creating what alternative historians call a lost common source civilization that seeded Egyptian, Sumerian, Indus Valley, Mesoamerican, and other later civilizations. But before we proceed further into this speculation, We must understand who the Anunnaki actually were, according to the texts themselves, not according to modern interpretations, but according to what the ancient Sumerians and Akkadians actually wrote. The term Anunnaki appears in Mesopotamian texts from the 3rd millennium BCE onward. The word is generally translated as those who came from heaven to earth, or, more literally, the offspring of Anu, where Anu is the supreme sky god. In the earliest texts, the Anunnaki are described as a group of deities associated with the earth and the underworld, in contrast to the Igigi, who were associated with the sky. However, as the mythology developed, the distinction became more hierarchical, with the Anunnaki as the senior gods and the Igigi as their servants. The texts describe a clear hierarchy among the Anunnaki, with 3 or sometimes 7 principal deities at the top. Anu was the king of the gods, dwelling in heaven, rarely intervening directly in earthly affairs. Enlil was the commander, the most powerful god actively governing the earth, associated with storms, wind, and divine authority. Enki was the master of wisdom, water, mischief, and crafts, dwelling in the Abzu, described as the subterranean ocean, but also as a specific location, possibly a temple or installation. These 3 divided creation among themselves, with Anu taking the heavens, Enlil the earth and air, Enki the waters and underworld. Other major Anunnaki included Ninhursag, the mother goddess associated with childbirth and creation, Nana, the moon god, Utu, the sun god, and Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and sexuality, who features prominently in numerous myths and is perhaps the most complex and human-like of all the Anunnaki, in terms of her behavior and motivations. What is striking about these beings in the original texts is how physical, how material, how unheavenly they actually are. The Anunnaki eat and drink, they get drunk, they have sexual relationships with each other and with humans, they get angry and jealous and petty. They fight with each other, they make mistakes, they fear death or at least fear losing their immortality. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the flood comes, the gods themselves are terrified by the destruction they have caused. The Anunnaki gods fled. They went up into the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs, crouched against the outer wall. Ishtar cried out like a woman in labor. These are not transcendent spiritual entities. These are beings with advanced capabilities, but decidedly finite, material, even vulnerable in certain contexts. The creation of humanity in these texts involves a remarkable process that, if read literally rather than symbolically, sounds like nothing so much as genetic engineering. In the Atrahasis epic, the process is described in some detail. The flesh and blood of a slain god is mixed with clay from the earth. The mixture is then used by the birth goddess to create 14 humans, 7 male and 7 female, through some kind of gestational process that takes 10 months. Different texts give slightly different versions, but all involve mixing divine essence with earthly material, often specifically mentioning blood, flesh, and clay, creating a hybrid being that possesses both human and divine characteristics, but is mortal rather than immortal like the gods. Sitchin interpreted the term clay as a mistranslation or misunderstanding by ancient scribes who did not understand biological concepts, that what the text actually meant was something like biological material or tissue. The divine blood and flesh would be DNA from the Anunnaki. The process of mixing and letting it develop would be genetic manipulation and artificial insemination, or perhaps something like cloning or in vitro fertilization. The 10-month gestation period would be literally that, a pregnancy carried either by the birth goddess herself or by female Anunnaki, or perhaps even by proto-human females who served as surrogates. In this interpretation, humans were created not through magical incantation, but through biological science, genetic engineering that combined Anunnaki DNA with indigenous hominid DNA to create a new species, Homo sapiens. Now, mainstream science has its own story about human origins, and it is worth understanding what conventional evolutionary biology actually claims before we explore why some researchers find it incomplete. According to the current scientific consensus, modern humans, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago from earlier hominid species, most likely Homo heidelbergensis. For most of our existence, we were hunter-gatherers with simple stone tools, and no significant technological or cultural advancement. Then, approximately 50,000 years ago, something changed. Suddenly, modern human behavior emerges. Complex language, symbolic art, sophisticated tools, long-distance trade, and social organization. This is called the Great Leap Forward, or the cognitive revolution, and nobody really knows why it happened. The genetic evidence shows that all modern humans outside Africa descend from a small population that left Africa between 70 and 50,000 years ago. This is the orthodox account, supported by fossil evidence and genetic analysis. But there are anomalies in this picture, gaps and contradictions that mainstream science tends to gloss over or explain away. The first anomaly is the sudden nature of the cognitive revolution. If human intelligence evolved gradually through natural selection, we should see gradual improvement in tool complexity, artistic expression, and cultural sophistication. Instead, we see hundreds of thousands of years of near stasis, followed by an explosive, sudden emergence of modern behavior. Some scientists attribute this to a genetic mutation affecting language or consciousness, but no such mutation has been conclusively identified. Is it not at least possible that the sudden leap forward was not entirely natural, that some form of genetic modification or intervention occurred approximately 50,000 years ago? The second anomaly involves certain genetic peculiarities that have puzzled researchers. In 2010, geneticists announced that non-African humans carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA, evidence of interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. In 2008, another extinct hominid species, the Denisovans, was identified from DNA extracted from a single finger bone found in Siberia. Further analysis revealed that modern humans also carry Denisovan DNA, particularly in populations in Melanesia and Australia. So, modern humans are not purely Homo sapiens, but rather genetic hybrids incorporating DNA from at least 2 other hominid species. This is accepted mainstream science. But it raises an obvious question. If humans naturally hybridized with Neanderthals and Denisovans, could we have hybridized with other species as well? Could we have hybridized with a more advanced species, a species we called gods? The third anomaly is more controversial but cannot be ignored. Certain unusual genetic features in human DNA that some researchers argue bear the signatures of artificial manipulation. Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA's double helix structure and a Nobel laureate, proposed in a 1973 paper the hypothesis of directed panspermia, suggesting that life on Earth might have been intentionally seeded by an advanced alien civilization. Crick noted certain peculiarities in the genetic code that seemed, in his words, too good to be true, if they arose purely through chance and natural selection. While Crick himself did not claim humans were genetically engineered, his willingness to entertain extraterrestrial intervention in Earth's biology suggests that the scientific possibility exists. More recently, researchers have identified what they call junk DNA, sections of the human genome that do not code for proteins and whose function is unclear. Some of this junk DNA is now known to have regulatory functions, but vast sections remain mysterious. Proponents of the ancient astronaut theory sometimes point to this as potential evidence of genetic engineering, suggesting that the non-coding regions might contain information or functionality we do not yet understand, possibly inserted by the Anunnaki. Mainstream geneticists dismiss this as baseless speculation, arguing that junk DNA is simply the result of evolutionary processes that do not efficiently remove non-functional sequences. But the debate reveals how much we still do not understand about our own genome. Let us return to the flood narrative and its immediate aftermath, because it is here that the Atlantis connection becomes most explicit in the ancient texts. After the waters receded, according to Mesopotamian accounts, the surviving gods conducted a kind of census and peace negotiation. Enlil, who had wanted humanity destroyed, was furious to discover that humans had survived through Enki's intervention. The gods argued among themselves. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Humanity would be allowed to continue existing, but with certain limitations imposed to prevent us from becoming too numerous or too powerful again. The texts describe these limitations as reducing human lifespan, which had supposedly been much longer before the flood, and imposing hardship, disease, and mortality as permanent features of the human condition. But there is more to this story, details that appear in fragmentary texts and are rarely discussed even by alternative researchers. Some accounts suggest that in the immediate post-flood period, before these limitations were fully imposed, there was a transitional generation of humans who lived much longer than modern humans, but not as long as the antediluvian patriarchs. These individuals, according to certain interpretations, were hybrids with higher percentages of Anunnaki DNA than ordinary humans, created or born in the immediate aftermath of the catastrophe when genetic mixing was more common or less regulated. These hybrid beings would have possessed enhanced intelligence, strength, longevity, and possibly other capabilities. They would have been ideal builders and organizers for a post-flood reconstruction effort. In Genesis, this transitional period is obliquely referenced in the infamous verse 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The term Nephilim is often translated as giants, but the Hebrew root suggests fallen ones, or those who came down. The sons of God in ancient Near Eastern context most likely refers to divine beings, what the Mesopotamians would call Anunnaki. So Genesis is describing a period when divine beings interbred with human women, creating a hybrid population of exceptional individuals described as mighty men and men of renown. When did this occur? The text says in those days and also afterward, which could refer to both before and after the flood. The Book of Enoch, part of the biblical Apocrypha, expands on this narrative considerably. It names specific watchers, angels who descended to earth and took human wives, and lists the knowledge they taught humanity: metallurgy, astronomy, cosmetics, sorcery, weapon-making, and various sciences. Their hybrid offspring, the Nephilim, grew to be giants who consumed vast resources and eventually began eating humans and each other, which prompted God to send the flood to cleanse the earth. But again, the text specifies that this teaching of forbidden knowledge occurred both before and after the deluge, and that some Nephilim bloodlines survived the catastrophe through Noah's sons' wives or through other means. Now, if we synthesize these narratives, a pattern emerges. Before the flood, the Anunnaki had established a thriving civilization on Earth with human servants and hybrid offspring. The flood destroyed most of this, whether as punishment, population control, or natural cosmic catastrophe that the Anunnaki knew was coming. After the flood, reconstruction began. The Anunnaki needed to rebuild quickly, but their infrastructure was devastated. They needed human labor, but also more capable humans who could understand and implement advanced technologies. So genetic mixing resumed or intensified, creating a population of hybrids, these Nephilim or mighty men, who would serve as intermediaries between full Anunnaki and ordinary humans. One of the primary reconstruction projects was the establishment of an advanced colony on a large island or cluster of islands in the Atlantic Ocean, a place where Anunnaki technology could be preserved and developed without interference from the now scattered and traumatized human populations around the world. This colony would be governed by Enki, Poseidon, and his offspring, a mixture of divine and hybrid rulers. This colony was Atlantis. As this question has developed, as we have traced the connections between Sumerian flood narratives and Platonic Atlantis, you may be wondering about the specific mechanisms of this advanced civilization. How exactly would Atlantis have functioned as an Anunnaki colony? What technologies would they have possessed? What would the society have looked like? But before we delve into those technical details, we must first establish the geographical context, the actual physical location where Atlantis might have existed. And here the evidence becomes simultaneously frustrating and tantalizing, because we are searching for land that no longer exists, for islands swallowed by ocean depths, for ruins buried under kilometers of silt and rock and time itself. Just as Enki shared forbidden knowledge with humanity in defiance of divine law, we at this channel share investigations that challenge official narratives and explore possibilities that mainstream academia refuses to consider. If this resonates with your own search for truth beyond conventional limitations, consider subscribing so you can follow this journey as we continue uncovering suppressed history and forgotten wisdom. The path ahead will take us into even stranger territories. Now let us examine where Atlantis actually was, a question that has generated countless theories, expeditions, and controversies since Plato first described it. He states explicitly that Atlantis was located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which virtually every scholar agrees refers to the Strait of Gibraltar. This places Atlantis somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, west of the Mediterranean. Plato describes it as larger than Libya and Asia Minor combined, which would make it roughly the size of modern Turkey, or larger. Critics immediately point to the problem. There is no evidence of any landmass that large in the Atlantic Ocean, either currently or in the geological past. Sonar mapping of the Atlantic floor has revealed underwater mountains and ridges, but nothing resembling a submerged continent of the size Plato describes. However, there are several problems with this dismissal. First, Plato's size comparison might be rhetorical exaggeration or might refer to the combined territory controlled by the Atlantean Empire rather than the size of the island itself. Second, post-flood sea level rises did submerge significant land areas. The continental shelves, the underwater extensions of continents that slope down to the abyssal plains, were above water during the Ice Age when sea levels were 100 to 120 meters lower. Some of these shelf areas are quite extensive. Third, there are geological features in the Atlantic that could potentially be related to Atlantis if we think beyond a single large island to an archipelago or a ridge system that formed a large habitable region. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge is an underwater mountain range running down the center of the Atlantic Ocean, from the Arctic to the Antarctic, marking the boundary between tectonic plates. At several points, this ridge rises above sea level, forming islands like Iceland and the Azores. During the last ice age with lower sea levels, more of this ridge system would have been exposed, creating potentially large islands or even a semi-continuous land bridge in the northern Atlantic. The Azores Plateau in particular has been proposed as a possible Atlantis location. It is a large underwater feature covering approximately 5.5 million square kilometers, with several high points forming the modern Azores Islands. Sediment cores taken from the Azores Plateau have revealed evidence of beach sand, at depths now far below sea level, suggesting these areas were once coastline. In 1974, Soviet scientists conducting research in the Atlantic reported discovering what appeared to be artificial structures on an underwater mountain near the Azores, including regular geometric shapes and wall-like features. The findings were controversial and not widely accepted by Western scientists. In the 1980s and 90s, various researchers using sonar and underwater photography claimed to have found ruins, including step pyramids and rectilinear structures, at various Atlantic locations, particularly around the Bahamas, the Caribbean, and off the coast of Spain near Cadiz. Most of these have been explained by mainstream archaeology as natural geological formations or wishful thinking, but not all. The Bimini Road, discovered in 1968 off the coast of Bimini in the Bahamas, consists of regular rectangular blocks of limestone arranged in what appears to be a road or wall extending for several hundred meters underwater. Initial excitement that this might be evidence of Atlantis was dampened when geologists determined that the blocks were likely naturally formed beach rock, limestone created when calcium carbonate in beach sand cements together. The regularity of the blocks, they argued, resulted from natural fracture patterns in the rock. However, some researchers continue to dispute this explanation, pointing to apparent tool marks on the blocks, the seemingly artificial arrangement, and the presence of what look like support pillars beneath some sections. The debate remains unresolved, because definitive excavation and analysis has never been conducted, partly because the site is in shallow water subject to strong currents, and partly because mainstream archaeology considers the matter settled and will not fund further investigation. More recently, sophisticated sonar mapping has revealed other intriguing underwater features. In 2000, Russian underwater exploration group claimed to discover ruins off the coast of Cuba at depths of 600 to 700 meters, including what appeared to be regular geometric structures and possibly pyramid shapes. Cuban and Canadian researchers who examined the sonar data expressed cautious interest, but subsequent investigation has been limited due to political tensions and the extreme depth. In 2001, marine architect Paulina Zalitsky conducted more detailed sonar scans of the area and claimed the structures covered several square kilometers and appeared to show urban planning with clear roads and building foundations. Mainstream archaeologists point out that 600 meters is far too deep for these structures to have been built during any human-accessible period, given sea level changes, and suggest the features are natural geological formations. The question remains unresolved because the depth makes visual confirmation extremely difficult and expensive. There are also terrestrial locations that have been proposed as Atlantis, suggesting that Plato's Beyond the Pillars of Hercules was either metaphorical or a scribal error, and that Atlantis was actually in the Mediterranean. The most popular of these theories places Atlantis on the island of Santorini, which experienced a catastrophic volcanic eruption around 1600 BCE that destroyed the Minoan civilization. The parallels are striking. An island civilization destroyed by volcanic activity and subsequently buried or submerged. However, the chronology is completely wrong. Plato places Atlantis 9,000 years before Solon, not 1,500 years, and he explicitly states it was beyond the Pillars of Hercules, not within the Mediterranean. To accept the Santorini theory requires dismissing Plato's specific claims as entirely fabricated or mistaken. Other Mediterranean theories place Atlantis in the Strait of Gibraltar itself, near Cadiz, or in North Africa, or in various other locations, each requiring significant reinterpretation of Plato's text. The Reshaped structure in Mauritania, also called the Eye of the Sahara, has recently gained attention as a possible Atlantis location because its circular concentric structure resembles Plato's description of Atlantis's layout. This massive geological formation, approximately 50 kilometers in diameter, features concentric rings of rock that from above look remarkably like a planned city. However, the structure is landlocked in the Sahara Desert, nowhere near the ocean, and there is no geological evidence it was ever an island or submerged. Proponents argue that the Sahara was once more fertile with lakes and rivers, which is true, but never was it an ocean or island as Plato described. Perhaps the most intriguing theory, and the one that best fits both the ancient texts and modern geological evidence, is that Atlantis was not a single location, but a network, a maritime empire with multiple centers, its primary capital being a large island or archipelago in the Atlantic that is now completely submerged, with secondary colonies or trading posts along the coasts of Europe, Africa, and perhaps even the Americas. In this model, the destruction of the central island by earthquakes and floods would have collapsed the entire network, with surviving colonies gradually declining and eventually being absorbed by or evolving into the early Bronze Age civilizations we know historically. This would explain why cultural and technological similarities appear across disparate ancient civilizations. They were all recipients of Atlantean knowledge after the empire's fall. This network theory aligns with the Anunnaki interpretation because the Sumerian texts explicitly describe multiple cities and installations operated by different Anunnaki deities in different regions after the flood. Enki's domain was supposedly in the Abzu, associated with fresh waters, and sometimes located in southern Mesopotamia, sometimes described as elsewhere. Enlil's domain was in Nippur in Mesopotamia. Other gods had their own cities: Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Babylon. But there are also references in the text to far lands beyond the known world, western lands across great waters. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Gilgamesh traveling to distant shores to find Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah, who survived the flood and was granted immortality. This journey involves crossing waters of death and is described as being at the ends of the earth. Could this be a distant Atlantean colony where antediluvian knowledge was preserved? Moreover, Sumerian astronomy showed surprising knowledge of the solar system's configuration. Cylinder seals and astronomical texts display what some researchers interpret as diagrams showing all the planets, including outer planets that should not have been visible without telescopes. While mainstream historians attribute this to symbolic rather than literal astronomical knowledge, alternative researchers suggest the Sumerians inherited this information from the Anunnaki, who observed the solar system from space. If the Anunnaki were capable of space travel, or at least had orbital platforms or observation capabilities, they would naturally establish colonies in geographically strategic locations around the globe, not limiting themselves to Mesopotamia alone. Atlantis would be one such strategic colony, positioned in the Atlantic, to control maritime routes between the Americas, Europe, and Africa. But what evidence exists for transatlantic contact and trade in the pre-Columbian ancient world? Mainstream archaeology firmly denies any significant contact between Old World civilizations and the Americas before the Norse briefly reached Newfoundland around 1000 CE. However, anomalies persist. Cocaine and nicotine, plants native only to the Americas, have been found in Egyptian mummies, including the mummy of Ramesses II. When first reported in 1992 by German toxicologist Svetlana Balabanova, the findings were dismissed as contamination, but subsequent testing on multiple mummies confirmed the presence of these compounds. Skeptics suggest contamination from modern handling, but the chemicals were found in the internal organs and hair, not just on the external wrappings. How could Egyptian royalty from 1300 BCE have access to American plants unless transatlantic trade existed? Similarly, ancient maps such as the Piri Reis map from 1513 show details of coastlines that should have been unknown to European cartographers, including accurate depictions of South America and possibly Antarctica without ice cover. The map's annotations claim it was compiled from older source maps, some dating to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier. Skeptics argue the map's accuracy is exaggerated and that the Antarctic resemblance is coincidental. But the existence of detailed maritime knowledge in the ancient world that was subsequently lost and only rediscovered during the Age of Exploration suggests that advanced navigation and cartography existed far earlier than conventionally believed. An Atlantean maritime empire spanning the Atlantic would explain how such knowledge could have been accumulated and then lost when the civilization collapsed. The presence of pyramids on both sides of the Atlantic is another tantalizing connection. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, and South America all developed pyramid building independently according to mainstream theory. But is independent invention really the most likely explanation when the structures are not just functionally similar, but often mathematically similar? The Great Pyramid of Giza and the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan have nearly identical base dimensions. The pyramids at Caral in Peru, dated to 2600 BCE, are contemporary with early Egyptian pyramids. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia, while architecturally distinct, serve similar ceremonial functions and represent similar cosmological concepts. If an Atlantean or Anunnaki source civilization taught pyramid building and astronomical alignment to multiple cultures, we would expect exactly this pattern of similarities combined with local variations. Cultural myths also show remarkable similarities across the Atlantic Divide. The story of a great flood appears in Native American traditions from dozens of tribes. The concept of gods descending from the sky to teach humanity appears in Mesoamerican mythology, with Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, described as a white-skinned, bearded figure who brought agriculture, writing, and astronomy before promising to return. This description matches no indigenous American population, but does match descriptions of the Anunnaki or Atlantean colonizers who supposedly taught similar knowledge in the Old World. The sophisticated astronomical knowledge of the Maya, who calculated planetary cycles with accuracy, matching modern science, the incredible stone masonry of the Inca, fitting multi-ton blocks together so precisely that no mortar was needed, the sudden emergence of Olmec civilization around 1200 BCE with colossal stone heads and no apparent antecedent culture, all of these suggest knowledge transmission from an older source. If Atlantis did exist as an Anunnaki post-flood colony, and if it maintained control or at least regular contact with territories on both sides of the Atlantic, then its sudden destruction would have cut off these trade and knowledge networks, causing the surviving colonies to develop in isolation, gradually losing the advanced technologies and navigational capabilities they once possessed, eventually devolving to the state in which we find the earliest known civilizations of the Bronze Age, advanced enough to build cities and monuments, but apparently having forgotten or lost the even more advanced capabilities their Atlantean predecessors possessed. This scenario fits the evidence of cultural decline and knowledge loss that appears in multiple traditions. The ancient Egyptians themselves claimed their knowledge came from the gods or from Zep Tepi, the first time, an earlier golden age when gods walked among men. Hindu texts describe cycles of yugas, ages of rising and declining civilization, with humanity currently in the Kali Yuga, the age of darkness and ignorance, having descended from earlier, more enlightened ages. The Greeks spoke of golden, silver, bronze, and iron ages, each worse than the last. This concept of cyclical rise and fall of civilization, of lost golden ages and recovered knowledge, pervades ancient thought. Modern progressive historical theory assumes continuous advancement, that civilization always moves forward from primitive to advanced. But what if the ancients were right? What if history is not a straight line but a cycle? Or worse, what if history is a story of repeated catastrophes that destroy advanced civilizations, forcing survivors to rebuild from scratch, gradually recovering lost knowledge over millennia? The geological record shows that Earth experiences periodic catastrophes, asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, climate shifts, magnetic pole reversals. If advanced civilizations arose during favorable periods and were then destroyed during catastrophic events, we would expect to find exactly what we do find: occasional anomalous artifacts and structures that seem too advanced for their supposed time period, myths describing lost golden ages and catastrophic destructions, and an overall pattern of knowledge appearing suddenly in the archaeological record as if from nowhere. Could you envision an alternative explanation for these global flood myths, for the sudden emergence of agriculture and architecture, for the mathematical and astronomical knowledge possessed by ancient civilizations, for the cultural similarities spanning continents and oceans? Some argue that independent invention, parallel evolution of human culture, convergent thinking explains everything. But this requires accepting an extraordinary series of coincidences spanning every aspect of ancient life, from architecture to astronomy to mythology. The alternative, that a common source civilization disseminated knowledge across the ancient world, requires accepting only one extraordinary claim: that such a civilization existed and was subsequently destroyed or forgotten. Which interpretation requires fewer assumptions? Which adheres better to Occam's razor? Let us now examine the technological capabilities that Atlantis supposedly possessed, according to Plato's account, and according to what would be necessary for an Anunnaki colony to function in the post-flood world. Plato describes Atlantis as having created a marvel of engineering, concentric rings of land and water, alternating, centered around a hill where the original palace stood. The outer ring of water was connected to the sea by a canal, allowing ships to sail directly into the heart of the city. Bridges spanned the water rings, and tunnels passed beneath them to allow ship passage. The entire arrangement was protected by massive walls covered in metals, the outermost in bronze, the middle in tin, and the innermost in orichalcum that flashed with red light. The scale of this construction would have been extraordinary. Plato specifies the dimensions, and scholars calculate the central island diameter at approximately 5 kilometers, with the entire complex spanning perhaps 25 to 30 kilometers across. Creating such a structure would require capabilities in multiple domains: massive earth-moving capacity to dig the ring canals, advanced materials, science to create the metal alloys and cladding, sophisticated hydraulic engineering to manage water levels and ship locks, and precise surveying and planning to maintain the geometric regularity across such vast distances. Modern engineering could accomplish this with bulldozers, cranes, concrete, and computer modeling, but how could an ancient civilization achieve it? Conventional archaeology would say they could not, that the entire description must be either fictional or wildly exaggerated. But if the builders were Anunnaki with advanced technology, or humans working under Anunnaki direction with access to their tools and knowledge, suddenly the project becomes feasible. What technologies would the Anunnaki have possessed? The Mesopotamian texts describe the gods as having flying vehicles called divine boats or heavenly boats that could travel between earth and heaven. The texts use specific terms, mu, ji, and din gir, which Sitchin interprets as rocket ships or spacecraft, though mainstream scholars translate them as names or titles. Regardless of translation, the descriptions are consistently of vehicles that fly through the air, emit fire and light, create great noise, and transport the gods between locations. Enuma Elish describes Marduk's 50 names, several of which relate to his control over heavenly ships and his ability to traverse the universe. The Epic of Etana tells of a king who flew to heaven on the back of an eagle, described in such vivid detail that some researchers believe it is a metaphorical account of actual flight. He sees the land below becoming smaller, the ocean appearing as a mere pond, then the earth disappearing entirely as he ascends into the heavens. If the Anunnaki possessed aircraft or spacecraft, this would explain numerous archaeological anomalies. The Nazca lines in Peru, massive geoglyphs depicting animals, geometric shapes, and straight lines stretching for kilometers, are fully visible only from the air. Conventional theory suggests they were created for ceremonial purposes, walking meditations connecting sacred sites, but this does not explain why the designs are specifically scaled and oriented to be viewed from above. If Anunnaki or their human subjects possessed flight capability, the lines make perfect sense as navigational markers, landing strips, or ceremonial art designed to be seen by flying gods. The runway-like cleared areas, some over 2 kilometers long and perfectly straight, closely resemble modern airstrips in their dimensions and construction. The ancient Indian epics, the Ramayana and Mahabharata, contain extraordinarily detailed descriptions of flying machines called vimanas. These texts describe different types of vimanas, their construction materials, their propulsion systems, their defensive capabilities, and even flight maneuvers. The Vaimanika Shastra, though its dating is disputed with some scholars claiming it is a modern text, based on ancient fragments, provides technical specifications, including metallic components, mercury-based propulsion, and electromagnetic systems. While mainstream historians dismiss these as pure fantasy or symbolic descriptions of divine power, alternative researchers note the specificity and consistency of the technical details across multiple texts. The descriptions include what sound like jet propulsion, laser or plasma weapons, force fields, and remote viewing capabilities. Are we to believe that ancient poets with no conception of aerodynamics or propulsion systems coincidentally invented descriptions that parallel modern aerospace technology? The Tully Papyrus, allegedly an Egyptian document from the reign of Thutmose III around 1500 BCE, though its authenticity is disputed, describes circles of fire in the sky, flying at great altitude, emitting foul smells, witnessed by the pharaoh and his army. While the original document, if it ever existed, has been lost and only translations remain, the description resembles modern UFO reports in striking ways. The Bible contains multiple accounts of flying objects. Ezekiel's famous vision of wheels within wheels, covered with eyes, moving in any direction, accompanied by 4 living creatures, described with mechanical precision, including beryl-colored wheels, rims full of eyes all around, and the spirit of the living creatures within the wheels. Secular analysis suggests Ezekiel saw a wheeled vehicle, or multiple vehicles with advanced sensory systems, operated by humanoid beings, capable of vertical takeoff and multi-directional flight. Theologically, this is interpreted as angels or divine manifestation, but if read as a literal eyewitness account, it describes technology. If Atlantis was an Anunnaki colony, it would have had access to some level of this technology. Perhaps not the full capabilities of the gods themselves, but at least advanced tools and knowledge that would seem miraculous to ordinary humans of the period. This would explain how the engineering feats Plato describes could have been accomplished. Excavating and shaping stone for the concentric rings could be done with advanced cutting tools, possibly laser-based or using high-frequency sound to shatter or soften rock, technologies that some researchers believe are evidenced in the precision cutting and shaping of stones at various ancient megalithic sites. The walls of Sacsayhuaman in Peru feature multi-ton stones fitted together with gaps measured in fractions of millimeters, surfaces polished smooth, complex interlocking shapes, including internal angles and curves that should be impossible to create with bronze or stone tools. The stones show vitrification in some areas, glass-like surfaces that require extreme heat to produce. Similar precision exists at Pumapunku in Bolivia, where andesite blocks, one of the hardest stones, are cut with machine-like accuracy, featuring drill holes of uniform depth and diameter, flat surfaces that are level to tolerances matching modern milling machines. How were these created? Orthodox archaeology attributes them to patient work with stone hammers and copper chisels over many years. But experimental archaeology, actually attempting to replicate these techniques, has found this explanation inadequate. Researchers who have tried to shape andesite with copper tools report that the copper deforms faster than the stone, making the process impractical for the volumes of stone involved. Stone hammers can chip and pound, but cannot create the precisely flat surfaces and perfect right angles observed. Some alternative researchers propose that the ancient builders had access to technologies we classify as impossible: acoustic levitation to move megaliths, molecular disassemblers or atomic softening to shape stone as if it were clay, or high-energy plasma cutters to slice through rock like butter. These sound like science fiction, but if the Anunnaki possessed such technologies and shared them with Atlantean builders, suddenly the impossible becomes merely advanced. Orichalcum, the mysterious metal Plato describes covering the innermost wall of Atlantis, has fascinated researchers for centuries. He states it gleamed with red light and was second only to gold in value. No known metal perfectly matches this description. Some suggest orichalcum was simply bronze or brass, alloys known to the ancient world, which can have reddish hues. Others propose it was a copper-zinc-gold alloy, or included rare earth elements that produced unusual optical properties. In 2015, divers recovered ingots from a shipwreck off Sicily dated to the 6th century BCE, which the discoverers claimed were orichalcum based on the high zinc content and golden red color. Chemical analysis showed the ingots were approximately 75 to 80% copper, 15 to 20% zinc, and small amounts of iron, lead, and nickel. This is essentially brass, an alloy that could have been called orichalcum, though whether this specific alloy is what Plato meant remains debated. However, some researchers propose that orichalcum was not a simple alloy, but rather an advanced material with unusual properties, possibly incorporating elements or structures we would now classify as nanotechnology or metamaterials. If the Anunnaki had advanced materials science, they could have created alloys with properties that ancient Greeks observing them could only describe in terms of glowing or flashing with light. Modern metamaterials can manipulate electromagnetic radiation in ways that natural materials cannot, creating invisibility cloaking, perfect lensing, or unusual optical effects. An ancient witness seeing such a material might describe it as metal that glows with internal fire. Is this speculation? Absolutely. But it is speculation constrained by known physics and materials science, not magic or pure invention. The hot and cold springs that Plato describes as existing on Atlantis indicate geothermal activity, which suggests the island was volcanically active. This is consistent with the Azores region and the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is a tectonically active spreading zone where magma rises from the mantle. Geothermal energy can be harnessed for heating, electricity generation, and various industrial processes. Modern Iceland derives most of its energy from geothermal sources. If Atlantis was located on a geothermally active island, the inhabitants could have used this natural power source for their civilization. The text describes sophisticated hydraulic systems, hot baths, cold baths, and canal systems that managed water flow. These are not the works of primitive Bronze Age peoples, but of a society with advanced civil engineering capabilities. The destruction of Atlantis, according to Plato, occurred in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods, after which the island sank into the sea. Geologically, this is entirely possible in a volcanically active region. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE destroyed Pompeii in a matter of hours. The Santorini eruption around 1600 BCE destroyed much of that island and created a massive tsunami that devastated coastal settlements across the Mediterranean. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883 in Indonesia killed tens of thousands and was heard thousands of kilometers away. Volcanic islands can sink or collapse, when the magma chamber beneath them empties during an eruption, causing the overlying land to subside into the void. This is called a caldera collapse, and it has happened repeatedly in geological history. If Atlantis was built on a volcanic island or archipelago, a major eruption and subsequent caldera collapse could indeed have destroyed it in exactly the manner Plato describes. But there is a detail here that is often overlooked, a detail that connects directly to the Anunnaki narrative and suggests the destruction might not have been entirely natural. Remember, the texts describe the flood as a divine judgment, a deliberate act by the gods to punish or control humanity. What if Atlantis's destruction was not a random geological event, but a calculated strike, a divine punishment for some transgression, or perhaps an internal conflict among the Anunnaki themselves that resulted in the use of weapons of mass destruction? The Mahabharata contains descriptions of ancient wars fought with weapons that sound remarkably like nuclear devices. Brilliant lights brighter than 1,000 suns, mushroom-shaped clouds, devastation covering vast areas, people dying slowly from invisible poison, survivors suffering from burned skin and falling hair. The cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, in the Indus Valley, show evidence of vitrification, flash heating that turned sand to glass, and elevated radiation levels in some areas, though this evidence is disputed, and alternative explanations involving pottery kilns have been proposed. Could Atlantis have been destroyed not by natural eruption, but by deliberate attack, possibly using advanced weapons? Plato's account states that the Atlanteans had become prideful and corrupt, that they attempted to conquer Athens and other Mediterranean civilizations, and that the gods judged them worthy of destruction. If we interpret gods as Anunnaki, this becomes a story of a colony that rebelled against its creators, that attempted to establish independent power, that perhaps even threatened other Anunnaki territories. Enlil, the commander who had previously advocated for humanity's destruction through flood, might have ordered Atlantis destroyed when it became too powerful or too rebellious. Enki, who supposedly founded Atlantis, would have been unable or unwilling to prevent its destruction, just as he could only save a small remnant during the original flood. This interpretation transforms Atlantis from a simple cautionary tale about hubris into a complex political narrative of colonial rebellion and imperial retaliation. There is another possibility that deserves consideration, one that involves cycles within cycles, destructions nested within destructions. What if the younger Dryas impact event 12,800 years ago did not destroy an already advanced civilization, but rather destroyed the Anunnaki's original installations, forcing them to rebuild, and Atlantis was this post-impact reconstruction effort? Then, approximately 11,500 years ago, according to Plato's chronology, a second catastrophe occurred, this one more localized, but devastating to the Atlantic colony specifically. This second event destroyed Atlantis, scattered its population, and ended the brief post-flood golden age of Anunnaki human cooperation. After this second destruction, the Anunnaki largely withdrew from direct human governance, maintaining only limited contact through priestly classes and royal bloodlines, leaving humanity to develop more independently, which is why we see civilization emerging gradually in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus Valley, and China over the subsequent millennia, rather than appearing fully formed. This staged withdrawal model fits the progression we see in ancient texts, where gods are extremely active in the earliest accounts, directly creating humans, causing floods, fighting wars, building cities, but become progressively more distant in later periods, communicating only through dreams, visions, prophets, or special intermediaries. By the time of classical Greece and Rome, the gods are almost entirely absent from direct physical manifestation, existing only in temples and rituals and myths about the distant past. This could represent a deliberate policy change by the Anunnaki, a decision to let humanity develop with minimal intervention after the catastrophes of the flood, and Atlantis demonstrated that direct rule was unsustainable or undesirable. Or it could represent a forced withdrawal, because their own civilization or presence on Earth was declining, either through conflict, resource depletion, or some other factor that required them to leave or reduce their involvement. But let us consider the political structure of Atlantis as Plato describes it, because it contains intriguing parallels to Anunnaki governance. He states that Poseidon divided the island among his 10 sons, creating 10 kingdoms with the eldest, Atlas, as High King ruling from the central capital, while the other 9 governed their territories with autonomy, but owed allegiance to the center. They would meet regularly in the central temple to conduct rituals, make laws, and settle disputes. This is essentially a federalized divine monarchy, a system where power is distributed among related royal houses, united by common ancestry and religious authority. Compare this to Sumerian political structure, where different cities were ruled by different Anunnaki, each with their own temple and priesthood, but all acknowledging the authority of Anu as supreme king of heaven and Enlil as his executive on earth. The parallelism suggests either that Plato was describing a genuine Anunnaki political system, or that whoever preserved the Atlantis account through Egyptian sources understood that system. The religious practices of Atlantis, as Plato describes them, are also revealing. He states that in the central temple was a pillar inscribed with the laws, and every 5 or 6 years the 10 kings would gather to conduct a ritual involving a bull. They would hunt a bull using only staves and nooses, no metal weapons, then sacrifice it over the pillar, letting its blood run down onto the inscription. They would then drink the blood mixed with wine, swear oaths to uphold the laws, and judge any who had transgressed. After dark, dressed in azure robes, they would sit in the ashes of the sacrifice and adjudicate. This ritual combines several elements: blood sacrifice, oath-taking, judgment, specific timing cycles, and transformation through dress and ash sitting. These are not random ceremonial elements, but specific religious technologies designed to create states of consciousness, reinforce social bonds, and invoke divine authority. Bull sacrifice was central to numerous ancient cultures: Minoan Crete, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia with its Mithraic cults, ancient India with its Vedic rituals. The bull represents power, fertility, divine force. In Sumerian religion, the Bull of Heaven appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh as a divine creature sent to punish Gilgamesh, which he and Enkidu slay. Bulls were sacrificed to various Anunnaki deities, with the blood considered to contain life force, the essence of the animal's power. The drinking of blood mixed with wine appears in various mystery religions and is echoed in Christian communion, though transformed symbolically. The timing of 5 to 6 years matches various astronomical cycles, particularly relating to Venus, which was associated with Inanna or Ishtar, one of the most powerful Anunnaki deities. Venus's synodic period, the time between identical conjunctions with the Sun as seen from Earth, is approximately 584 days, and 8 Earth years equals almost exactly 5 Venus cycles. This suggests whoever designed Atlantean ritual calendar was working with sophisticated astronomical knowledge. The azure robe sitting in ashes, judging in darkness after the blood sacrifice, creates a liminal ritual space, a moment removed from ordinary reality where humans take on godlike authority to judge. The color azure, associated with the heavens and with lapis lazuli, a stone highly valued in ancient Mesopotamia and often associated with the gods, particularly with Inanna, whose symbols included lapis lazuli. The ashes represent transformation, death and rebirth, the end of the old bull and the beginning of renewed covenant. Darkness removes visual distraction, focusing consciousness inward and on the spoken word. This is not primitive superstition, but rather sophisticated ritual psychology, designed to alter consciousness and reinforce authority structures. If the Anunnaki taught this ritual system to Atlantean rulers, it would represent transfer of divine governance technology, a method to maintain order and legitimacy when the gods themselves were not present. Let us examine Atlantean military capability, because Plato provides specific numbers that strain credibility unless we understand them in the context of an advanced civilization with access to superior organization and possibly technology. He states that Atlantis could field an army of 1,197,000 foot soldiers, 240,000 cavalry, 10,000 chariots, and 1,200 warships. For comparison, the entire Persian Empire under Xerxes in 480 BCE the largest empire of the ancient world at that time, fielded perhaps 200,000 troops in its invasion of Greece, and even this number is disputed with some scholars, suggesting it was far fewer. How could a single island civilization, even a large one, sustain a military force of over 1.5 million soldiers plus massive naval power? The answer lies either in federation or in technology or both. If Atlantis was not a single island but a maritime empire controlling territories on multiple continents as previously discussed, then the military numbers represent the combined forces of all territories, not just the central island. This would be comparable to the British Empire at its height, being able to draw upon military resources from India, Canada, Australia, Africa, and numerous other colonies, in addition to Britain itself. A single island might hold perhaps 100,000 to 500,000 people, depending on its size and agricultural productivity, but an empire spanning the Atlantic could control populations in the millions distributed across various colonies and subject territories. The 1,200 warships indicate serious naval engineering capability and maritime dominance. This is not a Bronze Age coastal trading culture, but a thalassocracy, a sea empire comparable to Minoan Crete, Phoenicia, or Athens at its height, but earlier and more extensive. Alternatively or additionally, if Atlantis possessed advanced technology, particularly in agriculture and resource management, it could support much larger populations than conventional Bronze Age societies. Modern intensive agriculture using mechanization, chemical fertilizers, and irrigation can feed 100 times more people per hectare than primitive farming. If Atlantis had even a fraction of such capability, perhaps through Anunnaki-derived knowledge of crop genetics, soil management, and water engineering, it could sustain a much larger population and thus field much larger armies. The concentric ring structure itself, with multiple layers of land separated by water canals, would have provided ideal conditions for intensive agriculture, irrigation, aquaculture, and transportation. Each ring of land could be cultivated, while the water rings provided fish, enabled boat transport, and moderated climate. The text also mentions horses and chariots, which is anachronistic if taken literally in the time frame Plato suggests. Horses were domesticated around 4000 BCE in the Eurasian steppes, and chariots were developed around 2000 BCE. If Atlantis existed 11,000 years ago, it predates both horses and wheels by millennia, according to conventional archaeology. This apparent anachronism is often cited by skeptics as proof that Plato invented the story or was describing a much later civilization than he claimed. However, if Atlantis was connected to Anunnaki technology and knowledge, it could have had domesticated horses and wheeled vehicles far earlier than the independent human development of these technologies. The Anunnaki, if they were extraterrestrial or simply more advanced, would have brought knowledge of animal domestication and mechanical engineering. They might have introduced horses from their own breeding stock or taught humans how to domesticate local equids. They certainly would have understood wheels and axles and could have introduced these concepts millennia before they appeared elsewhere. There is another interpretation of these military figures that deserves mention. They might be symbolic rather than literal, encoded numerical information representing something other than actual troop counts. Ancient texts often used numbers symbolically or as mnemonic devices. The number 1,200 ships might represent complete naval dominance, a formulaic expression of supreme maritime power rather than an exact count. The ratios between different military units might encode mathematical relationships or astronomical data. However, even if we accept symbolic interpretation, the text is clearly indicating that Atlantis possessed overwhelming military might, far surpassing any contemporary civilization, which again suggests either vast territorial extent or technological superiority, or both. Now, there is a critical question that we must address, one that goes to the heart of whether Atlantis could have been an Anunnaki colony. What happened to the Anunnaki? If they established Atlantis after the flood, if they ruled it for centuries or millennia, where did they go? Why are they not still here governing humanity openly? The ancient texts provide some answers, though they are fragmentary and subject to interpretation. The Sumerian king list and related texts indicate that at some point, Kingship ceased to be directly held by the gods and was instead transferred to human dynasties who ruled as divine representatives. This transfer appears to have been gradual rather than sudden, with semi-divine kings, demigods, and hero kings serving as intermediaries between the fully divine Anunnaki rulers and fully human kings. The Epic of Gilgamesh itself chronicles this transition. Gilgamesh is described as 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, a hybrid who possesses superhuman strength and longevity, but is ultimately mortal. He seeks immortality desperately, traveling to the ends of the earth to find the secret, but ultimately fails. His story represents the end of the age when humans could become gods, or when gods walked among humans. After Gilgamesh, the kings are fully human, and the gods recede into myth and temple. This narrative arc suggests that the Anunnaki gradually withdrew from direct rule, possibly because their hybrid offspring were declining in capability with each generation, as the divine genetics diluted, possibly because they themselves were dying or leaving Earth, or possibly because they made a deliberate policy decision to let humanity govern itself. Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki left Earth approximately 2000 BCE, when their planet Nibiru completed its orbit and moved away from the inner solar system, making travel between Earth and Nibiru too difficult or resource-intensive. He based this on his interpretation of Mesopotamian astronomical texts and on the timing of certain events in Sumerian history where divine involvement seems to cease. Mainstream academics dismiss the entire Nibiru theory as having no basis in astronomy or physics, correctly noting that a planet with the orbital characteristics Sitchin proposed would be gravitationally unstable and would have been detected by modern telescopes. However, the underlying observation that divine presence declines over time in ancient texts is valid regardless of whether Nibiru exists. Something changed. The gods stopped manifesting physically, stopped building cities, stopped directly ruling, stopped producing hybrid offspring. Why? One possibility is that the Anunnaki did not leave, but rather went into hiding, perhaps underground or in remote locations, maintaining only covert influence over human affairs through secret societies, mystery schools, and hidden bloodlines. Many esoteric traditions claim exactly this, that the ancient wisdom is preserved by initiates, that certain families carry divine blood, that hidden masters guide humanity from behind the scenes. The Freemasons claim descent from the builders of Solomon's temple and possess secret architectural and geometric knowledge. The Rosicrucians claim access to ancient Egyptian and Atlantean wisdom. Various royal houses have claimed divine descent or divine right to rule based on ancestry tracing back to gods. These could all be merely invented legitimacy claims, or they could represent genuine if diluted connections to Anunnaki bloodlines and knowledge systems. Another possibility is more sobering. The Anunnaki could have destroyed themselves in internal conflicts. The texts are full of wars between the gods, rivalries and betrayals and violence. The Mesopotamian pantheon is constantly fighting. Enlil versus Enki, Marduk versus Tiamat, Inanna versus Ereshkigal. Various gods forming alliances and breaking them, using humans and hybrid offspring as soldiers in their conflicts. If these were not metaphorical but literal wars between factions of an advanced species or civilization using advanced weapons, the result could have been mutually assured destruction or at least severe population decline. The strange accounts of nuclear-like weapons in ancient texts, the vitrification and radiation anomalies at certain archaeological sites could be evidence of such wars. If the Anunnaki fought each other to extinction or near extinction, the survivors would have lacked the numbers and resources to maintain their civilization and would have either died out completely or interbred with humans to the point where their genetic distinctiveness disappeared into the human gene pool. This interpretation suggests that the question of whether the Anunnaki are among ancient civilizations clearly shows either knowledge transmission or simultaneous independent invention. What do you think is more likely? Comment below with your perspective, because this question fundamentally shapes how we interpret all of ancient history, and there are compelling arguments on both sides that deserve serious consideration from anyone genuinely seeking to understand humanity's past. A third possibility combines elements of the others. The Anunnaki were never as numerous as the texts suggest, perhaps only hundreds or a few thousand individuals, and they suffered casualties from Earth's environment, from conflicts with each other, from the catastrophes they themselves triggered, and from natural attrition over millennia. Without the ability to reproduce quickly or to receive reinforcements from their home world or origin point, their population dwindled. They increasingly relied on hybrid offspring to maintain their presence, but each generation of hybrids was more human, less Anunnaki, less capable of using their technology or understanding their science. Eventually, the last pure-blooded Anunnaki died or left, and only the hybrids remained, possessing some residual knowledge and capability, but not enough to maintain the full technological civilization. These hybrid descendants became the priest kings of the early Bronze Age, the divine pharaohs of Egypt, the Lugals and Ensi of Sumer, the god kings of various cultures, ruling through claim of divine ancestry and possession of partial ancient knowledge. This model fits the evidence of gradual cultural transmission and gradual loss of capabilities over time. It explains why early dynasties in Egypt and Mesopotamia demonstrate more sophisticated knowledge in some areas than later dynasties, a pattern of decline rather than progress. The first Egyptian dynasties show extraordinary astronomical and mathematical knowledge embedded in pyramid design and temple alignments, knowledge that later dynasties did not possess or understand, leading them to build less sophisticated structures and eventually to forget the original purposes and meanings of the ancient monuments. Similarly, the earliest Sumerian texts display complex theological and cosmological systems that later texts simplified or corrupted, suggesting the earlier sources were working from better information or understanding. If Atlantis was the last major center of direct Anunnaki presence and rule, its destruction around 11,500 years ago would mark the end of the Golden Age and the beginning of the long Dark Age from which humanity only gradually emerged over the subsequent millennia. The survivors of Atlantis, both Anunnaki and hybrids and humans, would have scattered to various regions, some to Egypt, where they established the pre-dynastic culture that eventually became pharaonic civilization, some to Mesopotamia, where they became the legendary antediluvian sages, the Apkallu, who supposedly taught civilization to primitive Sumerians, some to the Indus Valley, to China, to Mesoamerica, to Peru, carrying fragments of Atlantean knowledge and attempting to rebuild what was lost, but without the resources and technology of the sunken island, forced to start smaller, simpler, more gradually. This diaspora model explains the simultaneous emergence of civilization in multiple disconnected regions around 3000 BCE, the Bronze Age revolution when writing, metallurgy, cities, and complex states suddenly appear in Sumer, Egypt, Indus Valley, and China within a few centuries of each other. If these civilizations were founded or heavily influenced by refugee populations or knowledge from Atlantis, we would expect exactly this pattern, a long period after Atlantis's destruction, where surviving knowledge is preserved orally or in limited written form by small groups, followed by a critical mass being reached where stable civilizations can be established, and the knowledge can be publicly implemented in monumental architecture, writing systems, and organized religion. The fact that these civilizations appear essentially fully formed, without clear predecessor cultures in many cases, supports the refugee founder model rather than purely indigenous development. But let us examine what specific knowledge these early civilizations possessed that might derive from Atlantean Anunnaki sources, knowledge that seems anomalously advanced for supposedly primitive Bronze Age cultures. Start with mathematics. The Sumerians used base 60 numerical system, sexagesimal, which we still use for measuring time and angles, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Why 60? Because it is highly composite, divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60, making it ideal for calculation and fractional representation without decimal points. This is not a natural or obvious numerical system for primitive culture to develop. It requires sophisticated mathematical understanding to recognize the advantages of base 60 over simpler bases like base 10. Moreover, Sumerian mathematics included concepts like place value, 0 as a placeholder, and geometric calculations including the Pythagorean theorem over 1,000 years before Pythagoras. Egyptian mathematics demonstrated similar sophistication, particularly in geometry and engineering calculations necessary for pyramid construction. The ratio of the Great Pyramid's perimeter to its height equals 2 pi. The ratio of its height to half its base length equals phi, the golden ratio. Whether these were intentional incorporations of transcendental numbers or coincidental results of the chosen design proportions is debated, but either way, the precision of the construction is extraordinary. The base is level to within 2 centimeters over a length of 230 meters. The sides are aligned to cardinal directions within 3 arc minutes. The internal chambers are positioned with remarkable accuracy. The engineering required to achieve this includes advanced surveying, materials handling for blocks weighing up to 80 tons, precise stone cutting, and sophisticated project management coordinating thousands of workers over decades. This is not primitive engineering. This is advanced civil engineering by any standard. Astronomical knowledge is perhaps the most striking area of apparent anomaly. The Sumerians knew about precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of stars and constellations to shift over time, completing a full cycle every 26,000 years approximately. Precession was supposedly discovered by Greek astronomer Hipparchus around 130 BCE, but Sumerian texts reference it much earlier, using terminology about ages and the movement of the vernal equinox through the zodiacal constellations. To detect precession requires centuries of careful observation and record-keeping, which implies either that the Sumerians inherited astronomical data from a much older source or that they were taught about precession by someone who already knew. Similarly, various ancient cultures demonstrate knowledge of planets beyond what should be visible to the naked eye. The Dogon tribe of Mali famously possessed traditional knowledge about Sirius being a binary star system with a dense white dwarf companion, information that should be impossible to know without telescopes and modern astrophysics. Yet their oral traditions describe it. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a Roman-era shipwreck and dated to approximately 100 BCE, is perhaps the most dramatic example of anomalously advanced technology preserved from antiquity. This device is a sophisticated mechanical computer using bronze gears to calculate and display astronomical positions and cycles, including the movements of the sun, moon, and planets, eclipse predictions, and the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games. X-ray analysis and modern reconstruction have revealed it to be extraordinarily complex, using differential gearing and epicyclic gearing that should not appear again in human technology until the 14th century CE in European clockwork. The level of miniaturization, precision machining, and mathematical understanding required to design and build this device suggests a much more advanced technological tradition than conventionally believed to exist in the Hellenistic period. The device is unique. Nothing else like it survives from antiquity, suggesting that either it was one of a kind or that other similar devices existed but were lost. If similar computational devices were common in earlier periods, perhaps even in Atlantis, most would have corroded and disintegrated, leaving only this one chance survival to hint at what existed. The spread of megalithic architecture around the world also suggests knowledge transmission from a common source. The technique of fitting enormous stones together without mortar appears in Sacsayhuaman in Peru, at Baalbek in Lebanon, at Stonehenge in England, in Egyptian temples, in Mycenaean structures on Easter Island, and in numerous other locations. The similar logic, despite local variations in style, suggests a shared understanding of engineering principles, that massive stones properly fitted create stable structures resistant to earthquakes, that moving huge weights can be accomplished through techniques of leverage, rollers, sledges, and perhaps methods we have lost. The sheer weight of some stones defies easy explanation. The foundation stones at Baalbek include the stone of the pregnant woman, weighing approximately 1,000 tons, cut from bedrock and moved into position. Modern cranes struggle to lift such weights, yet somehow ancient builders moved these stones using supposedly primitive technology. Various researchers have proposed lost techniques: acoustic levitation using focused sound waves to reduce apparent weight, electromagnetic manipulation using lodestones or other magnetic materials, geometric arrangements that create gravitational anomalies, even collective psychic power enabling telekinesis. These proposals range from physically plausible to wildly speculative. However, the alternative, accepting that ancient peoples moved 1,000-ton stones using only ropes, logs, and muscle power, requires believing they invested extraordinary labor for reasons we do not fully understand. If Atlantean or Anunnaki technology included advanced materials handling, perhaps gravity manipulation or anti-gravity platforms, as some texts seem to describe in the context of flying vehicles, then moving megaliths becomes trivial. Such technology, if partially preserved or understood by post-Atlantean cultures, could explain megalithic construction. As the knowledge degraded and the technology broke down over generations, the capability would be lost, leaving later cultures unable to replicate the achievements of their predecessors, forced to use less ambitious architectural styles. Consider the problem of cultural memory and technological regression. If a catastrophe destroyed modern civilization today, what knowledge would survive? After one generation, much specialized knowledge would be lost. Nobody alive would know how to manufacture computer chips, refine petroleum, generate electricity from nuclear fission, or maintain the internet infrastructure. After 3 generations, perhaps 200 years, survivors might preserve stories about flying machines and glowing screens and cities of light, but without understanding the underlying science. After 1,000 years, these stories would be myths, legends of a golden age when humans possessed godlike powers. After 10,000 years, only massive stone structures and perhaps a few corroded metal artifacts might remain as physical evidence, and even the myths might be so transformed and corrupted that they bear little resemblance to historical reality. This is the problem facing anyone trying to reconstruct Atlantis or pre-flood civilizations. We are looking for evidence of something that existed over 11,000 years ago, that was destroyed catastrophically, whose survivors became refugees in a hostile world, and whose knowledge was gradually lost as transmission across generations became corrupted and incomplete. The phenomenon called cargo cults provides a modern analogy for how advanced technology can be misunderstood and ritualized by cultures without the context to comprehend it. During World War II, American and Japanese forces established air bases on various Pacific islands, bringing unprecedented wealth in the form of manufactured goods, food, medicine, and technology to indigenous populations. After the war ended and the foreign forces withdrew, some island cultures developed cargo cults, religious movements based on the belief that if they performed the right rituals, built imitation runways and control towers out of wood and straw, mimicked the behaviors they had observed from military personnel, the cargo planes would return bringing wealth. To outsiders, this seems obviously misguided, but to the islanders, they were following the patterns they observed. People did certain things. Planes arrived with cargo. They did not understand aerodynamics, radio communication, military logistics, or industrial manufacturing. They saw correlation and assumed causation. They ritualized technology they could not comprehend. Now consider that the religions and ritual practices of ancient civilizations might be exactly this phenomenon occurring over thousands of years. If the Anunnaki did teach humanity agriculture, metallurgy, astronomy, mathematics, and civil engineering, if they did govern directly for a time and then withdrew, surviving humans would try to maintain the relationship through ritual, hoping that proper offerings and ceremonies would bring the gods back or at least maintain divine favor. The complex rituals described in texts like Leviticus in the Bible, detailing exact procedures for sacrifices, specific animals, specific timing, specific prayers, might be cargo cult behavior, attempts to maintain technology or relationship that was once functional but has become pure ritual after the underlying knowledge was lost. Similarly, the elaborate temple rituals of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the precise astronomical alignments, the sacred geometries, could be attempts to preserve and replicate what the gods once did, without fully understanding why or how it worked.